Welcome back. This is lecture 3, and we ended last class talking about the hierarchy that we use in Western ecology, starting from the individual and moving up, kind of like we said, like a Russian stacking doll set. And the largest that we had gotten up to, I think we ended at the biome level last class. So we'll just pick up from there. I just had a couple other things to say about biomes. And then we go to the last level in that hierarchy, the biosphere, which we've already defined back in lecture 1. I've included this picture here when thinking about biomes, because last class I showed you a map of different terrestrial or land biomes like deserts and grasslands and prairies and the boreal and maybe tropical rainforests as well. But I hadn't mentioned aquatic biomes. We also have aquatic biomes. And this is a picture of a transition zone between a marine biome. Remember our conversation or our lecture on the different types of water, and we had saline or salt water and fresh water, and we saw how most of the world's water is salt water. So the oceans are salt water, and here we have a transition from one biome, the ocean, and another biome, that's the fresh water from the river that's running into the ocean. And before it got to the ocean, in this picture at least, it flows through this wetland area here. And we see a transition from one biome to the next. And these boundaries, remember the discussion on boundaries, this is a natural boundary between two biomes. But what we'll notice and see in ecology and in the natural world, boundaries, while they are true boundaries, often will involve a bit of a transition zone. And so here we have a system that we would use the term maybe an estuary, because we have a mixing or transition zone between a truly freshwater biome in the river and a truly saltwater biome in the ocean. So the notes here on biomes state that there are no exact boundaries around these biomes. They're more transition zones that we will often use the term ecotone to describe. And sometimes when life forms, living things are moving from one biome to the next, they may need a time to acclimate, to become used to whatever the environment it is that they are entering. And a great example to explain and understand this comes from salmon. And I have this picture here. I don't know if you know of the artist Bill Reed. He's a Haida artist from, he's passed away. So the late Bill Reed from British Columbia. This is some of his work. This is a depiction of a salmon. And maybe, I'm pretty sure you've seen, if you haven't heard of him, I'm sure you've seen some of Bill Reed's work. If you want to see more of his work and learn more about him and his life, you can visit this website, and I've provided the link to it. But when I think about where you've most likely seen his work, if you have a $20 bill in your wallet, or next time you have one, flip it over until you see this artwork by Bill Reed. And he has a couple of pieces of artwork on the $20 bill. There's first this picture of one of his sculptures called The Raven and the First Men. And then there's this Haida grizzly bear over here. This is a picture of this amazing sculpture that he did called The Spirit of Haida Gwaii. And then there's a little section of a massive sculpture that he's done called Mythic Messengers. So that's Bill Reed. We saw his work on salmon here. And we're talking about salmon because we're thinking about these transition zones between one biome and the next. And how if you have an animal, for instance, that's entering one biome from another, they need to acclimate oftentimes to the environmental conditions that they are presented with. So salmon require, for their life cycle, they require both freshwater environments and the ocean. So here we have the life cycle of the Pacific salmon. And let's start off with them as eggs. The eggs hatch. The eggs are here in a river, freshwater biome. Freshwater, different chemical composition for sure than what we would see in saltwater in the ocean. So the eggs hatch, and we have these little organisms we call fry, and they get bigger. Maybe we call them fingerlings or smolts. And as they grow, they start swimming downstream from where they hatched, and they enter the ocean. And they spend almost their entire adulthood in the ocean until they become sexually mature, and then they swim back. And it's amazing to think, or they go through a bit of a color change too, but it's amazing to think about the chemical cues. How can they find their way all the way back from the open ocean, all the way back to that same river, to that same spot in the river where they hatched? So then they swim back, they spawn, they reproduce. As soon as they're done spawning, the female lays the eggs, the male deposits sperm. It's external fertilization. And after spawning has occurred, they die. And if you've had the opportunity to visit these habitats, let's say in British Columbia, after the spawn, after they've spawned, the fish die, and these systems can be just littered with all these dead salmon. Or maybe you've seen videos of grizzly bears fishing for the salmon as they swim upstream to their spawning areas. So we can think about the transition from freshwater to saltwater that these fish are exposed to. And they need to acclimate. Like if you would take the small fry here that's in the freshwater and just drop it into saltwater right away, it would most likely die. But over time, as it swims towards the ocean and it kind of acclimates along the way, it's ready, and it's ready for the saltwater environment of the ocean. Okay, well, we're ready to talk about that last group, or that last category within the ecological hierarchy, and that is the biosphere. And guess what? Here's a freebie. We've already defined this. We've already looked at this slide. We've already said that the biosphere extends from the bottom of the ocean into the atmosphere, and it includes all the earth and so it includes all the areas where living things are found. As ecologists, you'll notice most ecologists will study at typically the ecosystem level or the community level. Although you can have ecologists that study the entire biosphere as a whole, and we'll probably talk about those, or that form of study, maybe when we look at the Gaia hypothesis in future classes. For now, though, finishing up this intro to ecology section, just want to mention that ecology has strong ties to many other disciplines. Here is a report that I was able to help author as a Western science ecologist. I was working for a company at the time that was hired by the Tulita Dene Band to do an assessment, an ecological assessment of a certain area known as Bear Rock, and also in that close vicinity an area called the Smokes. And I just took this table from this document here because it emphasizes the connection that ecology has. So this is an ecological assessment, but as part of that, we needed to do things like study the geosphere or the geology, study the hydrosphere or the hydrology, study the biosphere. And look at this. You're learning all these new words, and now you can see them being applied because you now know what abiotic means. You know what biotic means. Under biotic, in this study at least, we had things like flora, that means plant life, fauna, that means animal life, and important habitat, that means what are the requirements that these living things need to survive. What kind of food, what kind of shelter, and such. So ecology has strong ties to these other disciplines. And in turn, ecology is incorporated in many other studies. This figure here shows a discipline called environmental science. And we can see that environmental science is a broad interdisciplinary approach that includes social and political and ethical dimensions, and as it relates to certain situations concerning the natural world and maybe humans' place in it. And I can see that when these environmental science studies are being done or assessments are being done, I can see that ecology plays a big role. Actually, ecology is part of biology. Ecology also uses chemistry. So these things are tied in, and they're also tied into a broader approach that is called environmental science. And this approach will also consider social and political and ethical dimensions. All right. Well, let's move from this intro that we've done, number 7, Intro to Ecology, to looking at two different general approaches to ecological studies. The first approach can be called an observational study approach or a descriptive study approach. And in this case, remember science, we talked about science is based on observation. And in this type of ecological study, you gather information and you describe the data that you've collected. There are no experiments being done. You're not changing the environment and seeing how it reacts. You're going out there and you're studying how it is, describing how it is. So we call these observational or descriptive studies. The picture I'm showing you here is an example of a descriptive or observational study. And I took this picture close to, it was in the oil sands, in the Athabasca oil sands in Alberta, close to Fort McMurray. And there'd been a fire. Maybe you remember, maybe 10 years ago or so, there was a terrible fire near Fort McMurray. Burned a good chunk of the town. But it also burned natural areas like this forest. And in this descriptive study, we were trying to understand or describe and observe how the forest was coming back after the fire. We didn't start the fire. It wasn't like an experimental treatment. We're going to burn this and see how it comes back. We went to areas that had already been burnt, and we observed and described which plants came back first. So that's one type of general study, ecological study, descriptive or observational. The other general type that we'll describe or discuss is an experimental study. And as this name implies, experimental studies have experiments. You do experiments in them. You change things up a little bit. And they're usually hypothesis driven. So you develop a hypothesis and then you design an experiment to test your hypothesis. Sorry. Excuse me. In this case, in this example I'm showing you here, this is an experiment that I conducted quite a few years ago, but I was interested in looking at how chemicals, specifically pesticides, and a pesticide is a chemical that's designed to kill a pest. And here in Manitoba, we typically use pesticides on agricultural fields to kill maybe insect pests or maybe to kill plant pests that we call weeds. And I wanted to see how they broke down if they're in the water and if light played a role in helping to break them down. And so I designed an experiment, and you can see here there was like a little floating structure, and on that floating structure beneath it, about 10 centimeters below, were these glass jars, and some of the glass jars they were blackened, so they didn't let light in, and some of them were clear. And I put different amounts of water from this wetland and different amounts of pesticides in them, and then they were floating here, and I could do this experiment to see what role light played in breaking down these chemicals. So when you design or you're doing an experiment and you're manipulating, you're changing some kind of condition, right? Not like those descriptive studies here. We weren't doing any experiments. We weren't manipulating or changing the environment. But in this experimental study, we were changing something. And in this case, I was changing how much light was coming in. So we have variables. We have two types of variables. These are something that can be changed up and measured. And we had independent variables, and we have dependent variables. And I think I have another slide later on that discusses these two, or I get you to do some brainstorming in a moment. So in this case, let's define an independent condition. This is something that we change up. So in this case, the independent variable was the light. Either light present or light not present. So that's what we manipulated. And the dependent variable was, in this case, the pesticide concentration. And we wanted to see if the independent variable, the amount of light, changed up the dependent variable, the pesticide concentration. I'm going to ask you a brainstorming question about variables here in a moment. But before I do, I just wanted to introduce you to different scales of experiments. So in this case, you can see the experiment was done on a really small scale. In fact, another word for small is micro. So I made these little worlds, these little cosmoses. You could call them microcosms. So I did the experiment in these tiny little containers. So that's one level of an experimental unit, a microcosm. Here's another example of a microcosm. We did this experiment in these Erlenmeyer flasks. So the experiment was just done in these little containers. And we call it, because there's kind of small experimental units, we call them microcosms. If we would go up one level, we can think of the word kind of middle or medium. Medium. There we go, medium. So sort of medium size, we get this word maybe meso, a mesocosm. So we go from a microcosm. Here's an example of a mesocosm experiment. They've got this big tub, and they've got these things, these experimental units, these mesocosms that they're studying. So hopefully you can see it's quite a bit bigger. It's a step up from this, or it's a step up from just these tiny little vials or jars. We're at a mesocosm level. Then we can take the approach in ecological studies where we actually study and do experiments on an entire ecosystem. And these are not done that often by a lot of ecologists just because we don't have access. Not everybody has access or the ability to manipulate and do an experiment on an entire ecosystem. But one place in Canada, one place in the world, pretty close to here in Manitoba, where they do experiments on an ecosystem level is at the Experimental Lakes area, or This is in the Boreal Forest. This is close kind of to Kenora. It's in Ontario. And it's a series of a number of lakes in which experiments are conducted on. And we'll be revisiting this area and talk about some of the experiments. For instance, one of the studies they're doing right now, they're trying to understand what happens to microplastic, to little pieces of plastic when they're in a lake. And so the entire lake has plastic added to it as part of the experiment. And then the scientists are tracking to see where the plastics end up. This would be at a very large experimental scale. This would be at the whole ecosystem experimental unit level. Okay, well, before we leave this, let's think about this brainstorming. And I'm going to give you this figure here, and let's see if we can read it and understand or determine what is the independent and what is the dependent variable. So this is a plot or a graph, and on the x-axis, so the x-axis is the horizontal axis. So on the horizontal axis, on the x-axis, I see temperature in degrees Celsius. So maybe you can kind of relate this to temperatures you know about. Maybe you know that water liquid becomes water solid at below 0 degrees. It's a freezing point. Or maybe you know if you want to go to the beach, plus 30 would be a good day to go to the beach. And if you wanted to stay home from school, well, minus 40, it was probably a good day. And minus 50, this might tell you perhaps this experiment, sorry, not minus 50, plus 50. Plus 40, that'd be pretty hot. You'd want to be definitely going to the beach. They don't even have temperatures below 0 on this experiment. But plus 50, we're not experiencing those. So this, you could probably guess, is an experiment that's being done in some kind of a controlled system. Then on the y-axis, that's the vertical axis going up, we have generations per minute. So this is the rate. This is like how quickly, you can think of it as a birth rate, but in this case, this is probably a cell, a tiny little microorganism, maybe a bacteria, how quickly it divides per minute. And we can see that as we increase the temperature, it's not dividing here at 0 degrees, it's too cold. 5 degrees, it's too cold. 10, it's too cold. When we get up to like 12, 13, 15, it starts, generation times start to increase. They keep increasing. Look at that. Now we're at 25. And you could say, or maybe someone would ask you, what's the temperature that has the highest generations per minute? Well, I would look, this is the highest up here. I go across, and then I go down to the temperature, and I don't know, maybe like 33 or so. And after that, wow, it got too hot, and these things aren't dividing anymore, these cells. So that's what it's telling me. And what is the dependent variable, and what is the independent variable? So the independent variable is what we're manipulating. So what are we manipulating in the experiment? What are we changing? What are we controlling? We're controlling and manipulating the temperature. So this must be the independent variable, temperature. And the independent variable is what is hopefully having an effect on the dependent. So generations per minute, this is dependent on the independent variable. So there we go. Typically in science, we will plot the independent variable. Standard practice to plot it on the x-axis, and the dependent variable on the y-axis. So we answered the first question in the brainstorming. Now, what might be the hypothesis that this experiment was testing? I'll let you pause and think about that for a few minutes. Okay, hopefully you've restarted the lecture because you thought about a hypothesis. What did you come up with? Well, one hypothesis might be that temperature does not affect generations per minute. There's my hypothesis. And then I do my experiment. And in this case, the way I wrote my hypothesis, I would reject it because I said that my hypothesis was temperature does not affect generation time. But after I do my experiment, I see that indeed temperature does affect generation per minute. And so I would reject my hypothesis. This is the approach that Western science uses for ecological studies, and it would follow the scientific method that we talked about in Lecture 2. Alrighty. With ecological studies, another tool that Western scientists often use are models. A model of a system, right? I don't know if when you were a kid or you had siblings or friends that had model trains, or made models, smaller versions of a real life thing. I don't know if they made model cars or something like that. Same thing with ecological studies. Models are a simplified representation of a real system. And I'll show you one model that I've worked on to kind of help explain what models are in ecological studies. In this case, we wanted to model what happens to pesticides when they enter a wetland. Remember that earlier picture I showed you up here? We were studying if light helps to break down pesticides or not in this wetland. This is kind of part of that same study, trying to model a wetland. And this is actually a stormwater wetland this is not where the study was done, but we're trying to understand, could we make a model of this and then try to understand what happens to pesticides? Or in this case, the model is looking at whether or not a wetland is a pesticide sink. So if something is a sink, right, maybe you own a house and it's a money sink, or you own a car and it's a money sink. That means you just keep having to put money into it to maintain it. Money doesn't leave, you put the money into the car. Well, a wetland as a pesticide sink means that pesticides enter it, but they don't leave it. Why don't they leave it? Well, maybe they're held here, or maybe they're broken down. So here is this model, a simplified version of a wetland. If a wetland was going to act as a pesticide sink, it had to meet the following requirements. It would first have to receive a pesticide, because if the pesticide's never getting into the area anyways, why do we care whether the system could be a sink or not? So it has to receive the pesticide, it has to hold the pesticide, and it has to maybe reduce the pesticide concentrations, maybe by breaking down, maybe upon exposure to light. Maybe it's retaining the pesticide because it's attaching to the dirt, or we call it sediment, the muck at the bottom of the wetland. But this is an example. This is definitely a very simplified version of all the different compartments I would find in a wetland. But it helps us as Western ecologists to simplify a system to try and understand perhaps how it works. In this case, how a wetland might function as a wetland sink. I can model it. So that ends that section on ecological studies. And next, we're going to move to talking about climate. And this is an important piece when we talk about ecological studies and ecology, because we'll find and see later that it's the climate that really determines the type of biome you have in an area. We know that deserts are defined by how much precipitation, how little rain they have. And that rain is an aspect of the climate of that area. Well, this is a picture I took in December of 2020, and I'm beginning to wonder if December 2025 is going to look like this. This is a little scooter that our family has, and this is the outdoor rink. It's parked in the middle of the outdoor rink. It's right beside our house. Our family helps to flood and take care of this rink. And oftentimes on December 9th, I wouldn't have been able to take a picture like this because instead of seeing grass, I would have seen ice. So what was it about 2020 where we were able to drive this scooter well into December? When we think about climate, we also have the term weather associated with it. So I'm thinking if you look at these two definitions, you'll be able to differentiate between what is weather and what is climate. And I like to use the example of thinking about, let's say you're inside, you haven't been outside yet today, and someone just comes in and you might ask, what's the weather like out there today? Because you want to know how you should dress. Do you wear your big jacket and boots, or are you okay just going out with your Crocs and a sweater? But if you're planning a trip, let's say you're planning a trip to Mexico, you haven't been there before, and you ask a friend, what is the climate like? Because now I'm packing for the climate of wherever it is that I'm planning on visiting. Well, let's look at the definitions of these two terms, and then you can think about why you don't ask what's the weather like out today, but why you ask that, but you don't say what's the climate like outside today. So the weather is a combination of temperature, humidity, precipitation, wind, cloudiness, and other atmospheric conditions occurring at a specific place and time. Climate, on the other hand, look at this, it's the long-term average pattern of weather. What's weather? We just defined it. Climates may be local, regional, or global. For sure, because when NASA is out there and the Canadian Space Agency is out there thinking about what is the climate like on Mars, there we are at an entire planet scale versus what it might be like on the Earth. Climate is also the aspect of the physical environment that most influences a particular ecosystem. This is why we're talking about climate in ecology, because it is so important in influencing what particular ecosystem is how it's going to present itself. I'm looking at this picture here that I took just beside our yard, looking at horse pasture there. Wow, it's pretty ominous weather that's on its way. At this specific place and time, I'm looking at these atmospheric conditions that tell me it looks like there's a storm coming. So there's weather, there's climate. And let's take a look at how important climate is in determining biomes. And to do so, we're going to look at this plot here, and we'll fill it in a moment. But before we do, let's orientate ourselves to what is presented on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, and what's presented on the y-axis, the vertical axis. So on the x-axis, we have annual mean precipitation, CM. What does that mean? Well, I think we know what annual means. Yearly. Mean. What does mean mean? Mean. Well, in this case, mean does not mean bad. If there's a mean person, or if there's a mean president, it means they're not nice. In this case, mean is referring to the average. We could substitute for our purposes average. So we could say this is the annual average precipitation. What's precipitation? It is rain, it could be snow, it could be sleet, it could be hail, and we can measure that in centimeters. At least that's what they're doing in this plot. Then on the y-axis, we see annual mean temperature. Well, we've already defined annual and mean, and temperature in this case is degrees Celsius. Okay, so we're seeing how climate, as represented by precipitation and temperature, really determines or dictates the type of biome that we'll find in an area, because it's precipitation and temperature that determines the vegetation, and it's the vegetation that in turn determines the type of wildlife that live in an area and defines and characterizes the biome. So here we go with that plot. So it's the same plot, now we've just added in the information. And I can see that if we have a situation where we have really low, it's very dry, not a lot of precipitation, so I'm way back on this side of the scale, but it's very hot, I see we have a desert biome. I think that probably fits what we have in our minds for what a desert biome looks like. On the other end of the scale, let's say if we had a very wet condition and it's also very hot, well then we see a tropical rainforest biome presenting itself. If we find where we live, well, at least where Winnipeg is located, we see that we have annual precipitation kind of in this range, and we have annual average temperatures kind of in this range, and I see that we are in this temperate grassland. We already mentioned that last class. We were looking at the tall grass prairie that we have here in southern Manitoba. So this is why we spend a lot of time thinking about the climate when we talk about ecology. Well, what determines the climate? So if the climate determines the biome present, what determines the climate that we have? Well, one of the big things is going to be surface temperatures. So we've got the sun shining down. So what is this figure showing us? We've got this incoming shortwave radiation. So this is energy coming from the sun at a certain wavelength, and it hits the surface of the earth. Some of it is absorbed, but some of it is reflected back. You see that? They're showing we got a big arrow coming in and a small arrow going out. So the Earth's surface is reflecting some of that radiation that it receives, some of that shortwave radiation. And some of that sunlight energy that's hitting the Earth changes from a short wave to a long wave and is re-emitted back into the atmosphere. And I can see a big arrow here. Some of it passes through the layer of the atmosphere and is on its way out to deep space. But some of it hits these greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, and bounces back down. It's re-radiated back, or bounced back, I should say, reflected back to the Earth's surface. So this plays a big role. Sorry, just getting some water. This plays a big role in determining surface temperatures. How much of that energy is reflected back or into space, and how much of it bounces back, or how much is absorbed by the surface of the Earth. And we have a term I'll introduce to you, right? We're building up our vocabulary. We're learning a new language, the language of ecology. And this word is albedo. And this is describing, the word albedo describes the quantity of energy from the sun that's reflected by a surface. So here's a picture I took a couple of winters ago, and I don't know what it looks like on your screen. This is not an oil spill. This is topsoil. And I see topsoil here, and then I see snow around it. If I'm thinking about as this shortwave radiation is hitting the Earth's surface from the sun, and it strikes this area here where there's a soil, this black soil, or it strikes the surface of the Earth where there's snow. Wow, where it hits that snow, much more of that is going to be reflected back, as opposed to where it hits this exposed dirt. So the albedo is going to really change. The quantity of shortwave radiation that's reflected by a surface is really going to change depending on, in this case, the reflective qualities, the color of the surface. Now, humans, we're going to spend, and I think it's in Unit 3, we talk more about anthropogenic effects. So we'll probably come back to this, but humans can really change the albedo of an area of the Earth. These are two images that I took from Google Earth, and this is in the Bridgewater area of Winnipeg. So kind of close. It's still in the perimeter, but it's kind of close to the Brady landfill. And I can see in 2004. Let's use this kind of as our reference point. Okay, so you can see this area of land is this area of land here to start with. I see in 2004 there sure isn't a lot of construction here. It hasn't been developed that much other than these agricultural fields. But in 20 years later, or 19 years later, in 2023, look how the land has changed. So if I think about the reflective ability of these surfaces versus the reflective ability of these surfaces now, well, you can see how humans can really change the albedo of an area. This is also going to really change how much, later when we look at how much water can percolate down into the soil, it can really change if we build a bunch of paved areas. But for now, we're talking about albedo and climate as it relates to how much radiation can get reflected by the Earth's surface and how humans can change that. Let's look at a few more concepts related to climate. Last class, when we were talking about how do you tell time, one of the ways we can tell time is what season are we in? I'm doing this lecture here in mid-November, and we're in fall here, getting closer to winter. So we can tell time through seasons. And some of the indicators that I know what season it is will be the temperature and maybe precipitation that I'm experiencing. So we know that as we cycle through in this part of the world, the 4 seasons, when we're in the summertime, we experience much longer daylight hours, much warmer temperatures, as opposed to when our Earth's axis, because of the Earth's axis, we're tilted away from the Earth here, from the sun, and we're experiencing much shorter daylight hours. Well, we are already experiencing that here in November, right? And until we reach the winter equinox and we start getting longer daylight hours again. So this number of daylight hours, as determined by the season, in turn can determine the temperature and the climate. And the temperature then is going to go on to influence the moisture content or the humidity of the air. And you can see that in this picture here. We're looking at the global distribution of mean, we know it means average, annual evaporation. So we can see that much higher evaporative losses in areas where, like near the equator, where we have warmer temperatures as compared to further away from the equator where we have cooler temperatures. Well, related to evaporation, we have another component called evapotranspiration. And this is the loss of moisture from evaporation from land and water surfaces and by transpiration from plants. I think next class or the following lecture, we'll be looking at the unique properties of the water molecule, and we'll look at how plants pull water up from the ground and lose water through openings called stomata. And when they lose that water, it evaporates it. It's been pulled up through a process called transpiration. It's been pulled up from the soil, and then it's lost to the atmosphere in a process called evapotranspiration. Well, I have this figure here. Maybe we'll come back to it, but this is a figure of, well, I see a river here. This is the Seine River. It's going to end up flowing into the Red River further north. This is near La Broquerie, Manitoba. And this structure here, you can kind of see the line here, the boundary of it. This is a treatment wetland that I helped work on. And this wetland receives wastewater, sewage, from a nearby community, and it flows through this wetland and it gets cleaned before it gets dumped into the river. And when this wetland was being designed, you want to see, how much water does it need? And one of the things you have to consider is how much water is going to be lost through evaporation, where water goes from a liquid to a gas, and also how much is lost through transpiration, where the plants are actually kind of having that conduit or being that avenue for water loss. So these are things that ecologists think about quite a bit. We mentioned precipitation earlier when we saw how precipitation and climate help determine what biome is present. Here is a figure that shows precipitation in this case, it's in millimeters in the world on this map. And I can see that if I go to an area that's light blue or dark blue, man, they have a lot of precipitation. And I can see a lot of dark blue here in this part of South America. And I can see, I bet this is a rainforest. This might be the Amazon rainforest. Or I can look for places that have red or orangish coloring. These have very little amounts of precipitation. Like this big swath, this big area of northern Africa. And I can say, I bet that's a desert. I bet that's the Sahara Desert. So precipitation is not evenly distributed across Earth. Something to note. When we're talking about climates, how close you are to the coastline of a major body of water is going to also determine what the climate is like. So maybe you've been to Vancouver or have friends or family that live there, and you might know by visiting there or talking to them that they don't have very harsh winters. They're not very cold winters as compared to the winters here in Winnipeg, even though we're not that much further north than Vancouver. But Vancouver is much closer to the ocean. In fact, it's pretty much right on the Pacific Ocean. And bodies of water, large bodies of water, take a lot of energy to warm up and take a lot of time and for that energy to be lost. So if you live near a large body of water, when the air temperature starts to cool in the fall and the winter time, because of all that energy that's stored up in that ocean or that body of water, that helps to regulate and moderate the temperature. So in this graph here, right, going back to graphs, we use a lot of graphs in Western science, a lot of plots. We've got the year. How do you tell time? Well, in this case, we're telling time based on months. And on the y-axis, we've got temperature. And we can see that if you live near the ocean in a maritime location, we don't get that cold as compared to maybe this continental climate here. Look at this in January. Maybe this is Winnipeg. We're getting down to like minus, well, that's not even that cold, minus whatever this is, 2, as opposed to what they're seeing in the Maritimes. Likewise, that moderate climate near a large body of water also doesn't get as hot in the summertime because again, um, is the energy, the heat stored in that becomes stored in that body of water, and it really helps to moderate the temperature in a maritime versus a continental climate. The topography will also determine this and the latitude. So, if we move from the equator to the North Pole, let's say, we're going to go from areas of high rain, tropical rainforest, temperate rainforest, maybe some grasslands, and end up in tundra ecosystems or biomes. We can also experience this if you climb a large snow-capped mountain. We'll start off, and as we climb that mountain, we might get up to a tundra type of a biome at the top of that mountain, and that's based on climate changes, local climate changes, as you increase your elevation or as you increase your latitude. So the latitude, we've got these lines of latitude 0. The equator is at 0 degrees latitude, and then as we move up, up and up and up and up, we'll have increasing degrees of latitude. Or if we're here at the equator and we're moving southward, likewise, we'll increase our degrees of latitude. Finally, when we're looking at things, at least in this class, when we're looking at determinants of climate, we can also have or see the role that mountains play in precipitation. Let's try and understand what's happening here. We've got the ocean, so maybe this is Vancouver here on the ocean, and then as we move away from the ocean, increasing elevations, we get into the Rocky Mountains, and then now here we're on the other side of the mountains, maybe by Calgary, let's say. We go over here by the ocean, and we get evaporative loss of water. And when that water goes from a liquid to a gas, it becomes less dense and it rises. And when it rises, look at this, it gets colder. When it gets colder, it becomes more dense and it goes from a gas to a liquid and it precipitates out, it rains out. So as this body of air, this air mass is moving over this mountain, so it's moving along like this, it hits the mountain and it's deflected upwards. When it's deflected upwards, it gets colder, and a lot, if not all of that all that moisture precipitates out. So you have this side of the mountain is going to be very moist, very wet, a lot of precipitation as compared to this side of the mountain, which is going to be very arid because this air mass has already lost. By the time it gets to this side of the mountain, it has lost a lot of that moisture. And we say this is now in the rain shadow of the mountain. We had a chance to experience this. There's a picture I took 2 summers ago in BC. And the sign here does a great job of describing these rain shadows on the other side of the mountain. So one side of the mountain we could see much different climate that supports different vegetation that required more water than we saw on the arid side of the mountain. Sticking with climate here for a couple more slides, we are going to talk about the greenhouse effect. And maybe in the springtime, maybe you see the signs for greenhouses popping up, or the greenhouses are now open. Maybe there's some temporary or seasonal greenhouses. And perhaps a greenhouse is either made of glass or plastic, and it receives that heat energy, or the energy from the sun, shines through the plastic or through the glass, and it strikes things, and it changes its wavelength, and some of that cannot then get re-radiated out. It can't escape from the glass or the plastic. And inside that greenhouse now, it's nice and warm for these seeds to germinate or these plants to grow that you want to sell at your greenhouse. Well, the greenhouse effect that we see on a global scale is similar, gets its name from like a greenhouse that's growing plants. But instead of glass or plastic, the substance that's holding or bouncing the heat back to the Earth's surface is going to be a gas, or going to be a couple of different types of gases that we call greenhouse gases. And we need to recognize, sometimes when we hear about the greenhouse effect, we only hear about the negative parts of it. But the natural greenhouse effect has been really important. If these greenhouse gases weren't in our atmosphere, then temperatures would have been too cold for life to have evolved the way we know it. So if we didn't have these greenhouse gases, as the sun's energy hits the Earth's surface and bounces back up, there's going to be no greenhouse gases to stop it from just escaping, and we would have temperatures too cold to support life as we know it here on Earth. So thankfully, the natural greenhouse gas allows for these warm temperatures that support life on Earth. So these greenhouse gases include things like nitrogen dioxide, methane, and carbon dioxide. Hey, we've heard of carbon dioxide. We've talked about carbon dioxide before. So that's the natural greenhouse effect. But we're learning, I think every lecture, we're learning about anthropogenic impacts, how humans have impacted the natural world. We've talked about these impacts. Maybe they involved, I think we saw that picture where farmers destroyed all those wetlands to create agricultural land. That would be an anthropogenic impact. Another anthropogenic impact is humans increasing the amounts of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. So you could think of it as, if this was a greenhouse, you're now increasing the ability of that greenhouse to trap heat. So maybe you're increasing the thickness of the glass or the plastic. And we get now a situation where we've intensified the greenhouse effect. And how have we done so? By mostly increasing greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. Or we're also increasing methane, or we're causing methane to be released from certain environments. We also increase, to some extent, the nitrogen dioxide levels, the nitrous oxide levels. But for the most part, human activities are having, we're increasing greenhouse gases like CO2 whenever we drive a fossil fuel powered vehicle. And now you can see that we still get that sunlight energy coming. That's really important. We still get some of it bounced back. That's going to be really important for life as we know it. But now we're getting more bounce back than we did in the natural scenario. We will definitely be returning to talking about the greenhouse effect in future lectures. Now we will be leaving this discussion on climate to looking at ecology at the ecosystem level. So looking at this slide, this should be a review from lecture 2. I think we were introduced to this hierarchy that we use in ecological sciences. And a lot of what we'll talk about today could apply to other levels, but we tend to focus on ecosystem ecology when we're thinking about things like really important components of ecosystems, such as things like, well, let me define an ecosystem again, and then maybe you can brainstorm or think about some abiotic components that we're looking at the ecosystem level. So ecosystems, they're the sum, all of the organisms, all the living things in an area, and all of their interactions with abiotic components. So in this picture here, this is a small creek in our close to where I live. This is called the Murray Creek or Murray River, and I can see pretty interesting. So I got some water in here, and I can see that as I move away from the river, I get different zones of vegetation. Isn't that interesting? These would be natural boundaries between this vegetation and this vegetation based on how close they are to the water. So water is going to be a very important component, a very important abiotic component when we study ecosystems and their ecology. Another really important abiotic component when we study these systems will be light. And I can't see the sun in this picture, but I know it's shining down because I can actually see things. And the other abiotic component that we'll be talking about in our study of ecosystem ecology will be nutrients. So we've got water, we've got light, and we've got nutrients. And I can see evidence of all of those in this picture. Well, I can see the water here. I can see water as gas here in the clouds, condensing and maybe precipitating out as rain. And I can see the evidence of light because I can take this picture, but I also see evidence of light because I see green plants here. And these green plants have been able to grow because they capture light and they use it to produce sugars. They also acquire nutrients from the soils that they're growing in. We're going to switch now to thinking about water specifically and how unique it is. Water has some characteristics that we don't see in a lot of other molecules. And I'm sure, if someone asked you what H2O stands for, we've probably all heard H2O. H2O is water. And where does it get those letters from? Well, the water molecule is made up of 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. And in this picture, I always think of it as kind of looking like Mickey Mouse. Although in this case, Mickey Mouse is upside down. Here are Mickey Mouse's ears, and here's his head. H2, 1, 2, O. That makes sense. Now the H's are slightly positive, as you can see in this picture, and the O in this molecule, the end that has the oxygen, that side of the molecule, is slightly negative. And because of this, because we have an end that's slightly positive and an end that is slightly negative, we say that this molecule has poles, like the North Pole and the South Pole, or like the poles of a magnet. So we say this molecule has poles, or we could say it is a polar molecule. It has sides that are slightly positive and some that are slightly negative. And maybe you've heard that term that opposites attract. Well, we can apply that to these water molecules, and we can see that how they arrange themselves, they tend to have one side, the negative side, slightly negative. So when it's in combination with other water molecules, it'll tend to maneuver around until it's matched up to a positive side of another water molecule. And we see that here again. Oxygen's negative side, hydrogen's positive side, and we have these bonds, how these molecules stick together. We call them hydrogen bonds. They're not as strong as this hydrogen-oxygen bond we see within the water molecule, but we do see some connections, some bonds between one water molecule and the next. And this is going to play a big role when we think about how plants are able to pull water up from the roots all the way up to the top of the leaves of their highest branches. Because as we pull one molecule of water up, it pulls the next one with it, and the next one with it, and we can have this whole chain of water molecules going from the top of a tree all the way down to the roots in the soil. So these hydrogen bonds are really important. We can also say that we also often call water the universal solvent. If something is universal, it means it encompasses everything in the universe. And a solvent is something that you dissolve items into. So if I think about, maybe you're making your coffee and you want sugar in it, the coffee water itself would be the solvent, and you put the sugar in and you stir it and you dissolve the sugar into the water, into the coffee. We call that coffee then is a solvent for sugar. We say that water can dissolve a lot of things. It can be a solvent for many things. It can't be a solvent for everything, but because it's a solvent for many things, we call it a universal solvent. And I'll show you an example. Perhaps you've heard of sodium chloride. A healthy diet, we need to watch our intake of sodium chloride or salt. After Halloween, my salt and sugar intake was very high because, the sodium chloride intake was really high because of all those little bags of Doritos and Old Dutch and Lay's potato chips that you give out or that you get at Halloween. So sodium chloride is table salt. We know that if I take a clear glass of water in a glass, and I put some salt into it, a teaspoon of salt, stir it around, I can't see the salt anymore. And look what's happening. Salt is made of sodium and chloride. I see that the sodium is positively charged and the chlorine is slightly negative. When I put sodium chloride in water, the water molecules orientate themselves so that their negative sides face towards the positive sodium and their positive sides face towards the negative chlorine. And now I can't see the salt anymore because it's been dissolved by these water molecules. This makes water very powerful. If you think about washing your hands, washing your clothes, washing anything, we typically start with water because water in that washing process can dissolve a lot of the things that might be on our clothes or on our hands. Water, unique property number one, it's a polar molecule. It has hydrogen bonds. It is a universal solvent. Here we have this term evapotranspiration. Remember, we saw it earlier when we were at that wetland near the Seine River, and we talked about how those plants were able to suck the water. Seemingly, they seem to be sucking the water out of the soil and causing it to be evaporated. Well, how do they do that? You can take whole courses. I'm teaching a course next semester called botany. And in that course, we study plants, and we spend a lot of time looking at how plants are able to move things like sap and water. How does your body move stuff? We have pumps. We have a major pump in our body called a heart. And that heart pumps our blood, and the blood carries with it gases and nutrients. Trees don't have pumps. So we're trying to figure out how are they able, look at this tall tree. How is it able to get water from way down here all the way up? Well, it does so partially because water is a polar molecule. And we see at the bottom end of a tree, the bottom side of a leaf, we have these little openings called stomas. And when one water molecule evaporates because the temperature is warm, it's lost. It goes from a liquid to a gas. It's lost. As it leaves, it pulls the next one with it because all these water molecules are bound together all the way down in this tube called xylem, this xylem tube, all the way down to the roots. Really amazing. And it's all because water has this unique property. The other unique property of water that we wanted to identify is that water, when it is a solid, is less dense than when it is a liquid. This is pretty incredible because if we think of things, we usually think that things are more dense when they're a solid. Let's see what happens with water. So I'm looking at this picture here, this diagram. Hopefully you can see all these little Mickey Mouse heads, and you can say the blue here is the oxygen, and the light color here, spheres, represents hydrogen. So this is one water molecule. Here we have water molecules that are really far apart. Look at all that space. So this isn't very dense. These are water molecules as they appear in a gas, vapor. And they have lots of energy. Look at them moving around, you can see in this picture. But if I take away some of their energy and they start to slow down, they don't move around so much, and they become compacted or more dense. And I go from a gas to a liquid. Maybe you've done this. Maybe you're boiling water and you hold a plate over the pot that's boiling water, and you can see that the steam as it rises has lots of energy, but when it hits the plate, it cools, loses some of the energy, and becomes a liquid. But what happens when I take away even more of the energy? So these things are moving around, and I take more of that energy away. Are they going to get even more packed together as a solid? Well, most things do so. Most materials, when they go from a liquid to a solid, become more dense, but not water. And that's because when I take away more of this energy, all of a sudden, the water molecules realign. They're not moving around at all, really, that much. Well, a lot less. I'm taking away some more of the energy by cooling them. And then all of a sudden, I get these hydrogen bonds forming between one molecule of water and the next, in a very efficient form like this. And now look at all this space. Sure, it's not as much space as I saw over here, but it's definitely more space than I see as I saw here when water is a liquid. So water as a solid, as ice, has more space. It's less dense. This is extremely important when we think about ecology. And I'm going to end with with a brainstorm exercise here. Provide a common example. Think about a glass of water with ice cubes. That shows how water as a solid is less dense than water as a liquid. Then, think about this. When water freezes in a puddle, pond, lake, river, or ocean, does it freeze from the top down or from the bottom up? Explain your answer using what we just learned about the properties of water. Okay, you can pause the video and answer these for yourself. Well, we have 2 minutes left in this lecture. Now, hopefully you reset and had a chance to think about this brainstorm exercise. So let's just answer these two things here. First of all, you get a glass of water, ice water at a restaurant, and you want ice cubes in it. Do the ice cubes sink? Are they at the bottom of your glass? No, they're at the top of your glass. They're not sinking in your water. And that's because ice as a solid is less dense than water. Water as a solid, ice, is less dense than water as a liquid. And that's why the less dense ice is at the top, or is floating on the the more dense liquid. And then thinking about this, if I see this picture over here, this is in a field near our house. This little dog's able to walk on this water because it's a solid. How did this water form? How did this ice form? Well, it forms from the top down because, well, we just learned that water as a solid is less dense than water as a liquid. So it's going to form from the top down. You know, if we look at the thickness of ice on a body of water, like a lake, for instance, if you have really cold winters, we can track and see how that ice continues to get thicker and thicker over the winter, but it's forming from the top down. We'll revisit the formation of ice on a lake or a river in the fall and winter in future lectures. But we'll wrap up today's lecture. It's an hour and 15, I see, pretty close. And again, as I've mentioned before, if you have any questions on material we talk about in lectures, please note that and send me an email and we'll answer the questions for you. Okay, take care. See you in lecture 4. Bye.